I always believed you had to earn your place in the world. My name is Lyra Perry, and I just earned mine a beautiful new home bought with my own hard work after closing the biggest deal of my life. I was still on the plane when I saw the video. My brother live streaming from my living room, my parents assigning themselves bedrooms. They weren't visiting, they were moving in. They saw my success as their property. They believed I owed them my life, starting with my house. This is the story of the choice they forced me to make, and the day I called the police on my own family. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The muffled thump of the landing gear deploying was my cue to surface. For 12 hours, I'd been suspended between Frankfurt and Chicago, between the closing of the biggest deal of my life and the beginning of a new chapter. I am Lyra Perry. I'm 29, a software entrepreneur, and I thrive on the clean binary logic of code. You work hard, you solve the problem, you achieve the result. This trip was the result. I'd gone toe-to-toe with German executives twice my age and walked away with a contract that would triple my company's valuation. I'd done it solo, fueled by stale pretzels and the sharp, satisfying click of my own mind working. I'm proud of what I've built. And I am to my bones protective of my personal space because I've had to fight for every inch of it. My phone stayed dark as I navigated the familiar controlled chaos of O'Hare. I resisted the urge to check in. This quiet, anonymous bubble of transit was mine. The drive back to my hometown, a small, cozy suburb that felt a world away from the city's steel canyons, was automatic. The neighborhoods were familiar, the streets lined with maples turning a burnished gold. It was the image of American comfort, the kind of place where people respected property lines and waved to their neighbors. It was the perfect place for my new home. I hadn't just bought a house. I'd made a declaration. For the last month, the only thing that kept me going through the pre-trip crunch and the marathon negotiations was the thought of my new keys. I'd closed on the 1920s Craftsman just days before my flight, a symbolic achievement representing every late night, every line of code, every time I'd bet on myself and won. It was my stake in the ground, my autonomy built with my own hands and my own mind. It was my sanctuary. My phone finally buzzed to life as I turned onto the main drag, and the family group chat illuminated the screen. The Nest, a name my mother Diane had chosen years ago. I'd sent them a picture from the closing, me beaming, holding the keys in front of the sold sign. It's official, can't wait to move in properly when I get back from Germany. The replies, which I'd only skimmed at the time, now seemed to hang in the air. My mother Diane, it's an awfully big house for just one person, Lyra. You'll be lonely in there. My father Harold. Good investment. Make sure someone is checking on the pipes while you're gone. A new place like that needs to be watched. My younger brother Miles. Sick. That basement looks perfect for my setup. We should all come over and christen the place when you land. I'd typed back a quick, just landed. Exhausted but happy. I'll be focusing on settling in this weekend. Talk soon. Their responses were so typical. The subtle resentment of my independence. The hints of entitlement, as if my success was a resource they were entitled to tap. Miles, perpetually in his late 20s, still treating my life as an extension of his. My parents, who saw my boundaries as a personal affront, a failure of family values. For them, my fierce need for personal freedom was just a phase I needed to get over. But for me, it was survival. I turned onto Maplewood Drive, and there it was. My house. Solid, beautiful windows, dark. It was perfect. I parked across the street, just wanting a minute to look at it, to let the reality sink in. This was mine, the fruit of my labor, the place where I and I alone would set the terms. My phone vibrated violently, a video call. Chloe, my old college roommate currently teaching in Seoul. It was 4 a.m. her time. My stomach tightened. I answered. Lyra. Chloe's face was grainy, her eyes wide with confusion. Thank God. Are you okay? I thought you were in Europe. I just got back, I said, my voice hoarse. I gestured out the windshield. I'm literally sitting outside my new house right now. Why, what's wrong? I think you need to see this, she said. I just got a notification. Your brother Miles, he's live streaming. He's always live streaming, I said, a wave of annoyance cutting through my exhaustion. What's he done now? No, Lyra, look. Chloe flipped her camera. She was pointing it at her laptop where an Instagram live video was playing. The video was shaky, filmed by Miles. But he wasn't in his cramped apartment. He was inside my house. I watched my blood turning to ice water. The camera panned across my empty living room, the one I hadn't even spent a night in. And it wasn't empty anymore. Check it out. Miles was grinning into his phone, his voice echoing in the unfurnished space. New Perry family compound. My sister really hooked us up. The camera swung around. There was my father Harold grunting as he and another man I didn't recognize hauled their ancient floral-patterned sofa through my front door. My mother Diane was directing them, her hands on her hips. Put it against that wall, Harry. It gets the best light there. Lyra won't mind, she never liked that modern stuff anyway. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a visit. This wasn't checking the pipes. The video feed followed Miles as he bounded up the stairs. I call the master, he yelled, pushing open the door to my bedroom. It's got the ensuite bath. Mom and Dad can have the big room downstairs by the den. This place is way better than their rental. They were moving in. They had keys. They had seen my text that I was landing, seen my exhaustion, and instead of waiting, they had decided to take. They were assigning bedrooms. They were rearranging my belongings, or rather replacing them with their own, before I had even unlocked the door myself. I couldn't hear Chloe's voice anymore. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears, and Miles's voice on the video, "Welcome home, Perrys." I fumbled with the phone, my fingers numb, and ended the call. I stared at the house. My house. Through the front window I could see the silhouette of my mother pointing at a wall. They were in there. Right now. Moving in. Without my consent. My achievement, my symbol, my autonomy. All of it violated in a single entitled act. I sat there in the dark, the glow of my phone illuminating the absolute stillness of my car. Across the street, a light flicked on in what was supposed to be my study. My hand was shaking, but not from the chill of the late October air. It was a cold, sharp rage so potent it made my vision tunnel. I watched frozen as my own family, the three people who were supposed to be my foundation, dismantled my life before I'd even begun to live it. The Instagram Live had ended, but the reality was playing out right in front of me. Silhouettes moved behind my curtains, their shadows trespassing on my walls. This wasn't just them crashing for a night. This was a hostile takeover. This was a violation. My mind flashed back a rapid, sickening slideshow of my entire life. I saw Miles at 12 taking my new bike, the one I'd saved for 6 months to buy, and riding it until he cracked the frame, then shrugging when I cried. It's just a bike, Lyra. We share. My parents had backed him up. He's your brother, honey. Don't be so selfish. Selfish. The word they'd always used to pare me down, to keep me small. I saw my mother in my first college dorm room, rearranging the furniture I'd carefully placed, clucking her tongue. This is all wrong, Lyra. You have no eye for this. Let me fix it. She wasn't fixing it. She was asserting control, making my small square of independence hers. I saw my father Harold when I told him I was quitting my stable corporate job to launch my own software company. He'd barely looked up from his newspaper. That's a nice little hobby, sweetheart. Just don't come asking for a bailout when it fails. Your brother's landscaping business. Now that's real work. The subtle jealousy, the constant dismissal, the unspoken competition. Miles was the real work son. I was the hobby daughter. My success wasn't seen as my own. It was a fluke. And if it wasn't a fluke, it was a resource they were owed. I'd spent my entire life building walls to protect myself, and I'd just bought the biggest, strongest wall of all. And they'd just walked right through the front door with a key I never gave them. How did they even get a key? The realtor. A lockbox. It didn't matter. They had planned this. They had waited until I was 30,000 feet in the air, vulnerable and out of reach to make their move. My disbelief was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was layered with a sour, familiar guilt. They're my family. They must be in some kind of trouble. Maybe their lease was up. Why didn't they just ask? But I knew why. Because asking meant I could say no. Taking meant I couldn't. This wasn't a request for help. It was a declaration of ownership. My anger was a cleaner burn. It cut right through the guilt. This was a blatant violation of my rights, my work, my freedom. The American dream isn't just about owning property. It's about the right to choose. The right to your own space, your own life, free from coercion. They were treating me not as a 29-year-old entrepreneur, but as a rebellious child whose assets were still fundamentally theirs. I felt a wave of profound, aching vulnerability. They knew this would hurt me. They knew I was exhausted from my trip. They counted on it. They counted on my fatigue, my love for them, and my deep-seated, trained-in-the-bone reluctance to cause a scene. They expected me to sigh, to cry, to yell, and then ultimately to capitulate. They expected me to walk in that door, throw up my hands and say, "Fine. You can have the master miles. I'll take the guest room." My role in this family had always been the overachieving, guilt-ridden provider. The one who smoothed things over, the one who paid for dinner, the one who swallowed her own needs to keep the peace. And as I sat in my car, watching my father drag a hideous beige recliner, his recliner through my doorway, I felt that role crack wide open. My autonomy wasn't something they could grant me. It was something I had to take. It was something I now had to defend. This was not a family dispute. This was a property dispute. And I could not passively accept this. The vulnerable girl who just wanted her family's approval was still in the car, yes, but the woman who had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal in a foreign country was taking the wheel. The switch flipped. The emotional fog of disbelief and guilt evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard clarity I felt when debugging a critical piece of code. I saw the problem. I saw the breach. And I knew exactly what the solution had to be. I would not be knocking on that door. I would not be ringing the bell. I would not be engaging in a screaming match on the lawn they now believed was theirs. That was their game, a game of emotional manipulation and blurred boundaries. I was done playing. I was going to play mine. I put the car in reverse, backed slowly down the street, and parked around the corner out of sight. The engine died, and the silence was absolute. My hands were steady now. I pulled up my phone. My thumb hovered over my mother's contact over Miles's. Then I scrolled past them. My first call wasn't to my family. It was to the 24/7 number for A-Prime Security Solutions, the top security consultant firm in the state. "Yes," I said, my voice low and even. "I need an emergency consultation for a high-priority property securing. I have unauthorized occupants in my new home." I listened for a moment, then nodded. "Tonight. Yes. Cost is not an object." I hung up and immediately dialed my second number, the personal cell of the real estate attorney who had handled my closing. "Michael, Lyra Perry. I'm sorry to call so late." I paused, watching a light go on in my new kitchen. "We have a problem with the new property on Maplewood. A big one. I need to know the fastest way to legally remove squatters. And yes, they're my family." I didn't sleep. I checked into a generic business hotel 10 miles away, a sterile anonymous room that became my command center. My exhaustion was gone, burned away by a cold, sharp adrenaline that felt terrifyingly familiar. It was the same focus I had during finals, during my first product launch, during the high-stakes negotiation in Frankfurt. My laptop was open, my phone hot against my ear. The first call to Michael, my lawyer, had been brutal and short. "They're not tenants, Lyra," he'd said, his voice clipped and professional. "They have no lease. They entered without your presence or permission. They are trespassers, period. You are within your full rights to secure your property." His words were a steel rod in my spine. This wasn't a family squabble. It was a legal breach. My next call was to Evans, the team lead from A-Prime Security. He met me in the hotel lobby at 1 a.m., a burly ex-military guy with eyes that assessed everything and revealed nothing. He didn't judge. He just listened, took notes, and looked at the blueprints of my house on my laptop. "They're in there now," I said, my voice low. "I saw them moving in. They'll likely be out tomorrow getting more of their things." "They'll leave the house unsecured," he asked. "They'll leave it locked with the spare key they have," I corrected. "They're arrogant. They don't believe I'll do anything. They think I'll just show up and cry." "They're wrong," he stated. It wasn't a question. "We'll move at 10 a.m. We'll be in and out in an hour. They'll never know we were there until it's too late." And so I sat sipping bitter hotel coffee, coordinating a digital siege on my own home. I was methodical focused. I approved the work order, new high-security deadbolts, commercial-grade digital keypads on all exterior doors, including the garage and the back patio, and a full perimeter surveillance system. 8 4K cameras, motion-activated with night vision and audio recording capabilities. Everything feeding directly to a secure cloud server and an app on my phone. My resilience wasn't about shouting, it was about strategy. My problem-solving skills, honed by years of debugging code, were now being applied to my own family. They were a vulnerability in my system, a security breach that had to be patched. At 10:05 a.m. my phone buzzed. A text from a neighbor I'd met once, the one I'd asked to keep an eye out. "Your family just left in your brother's van and your dad's car. Looked like they were heading for the storage center on Route 8. The trap was set." At 10:15 a.m., Evans's team, 2 unmarked black vans, rolled silently onto Maplewood Drive. I watched it all from a live feed set up by one of his techs from across the street. They were ghosts. They didn't kick in the door. They professionally picked the existing lock in under 10 seconds. They swarmed the house, a black-clad, efficient team. They replaced the locks, installed the keypads, and mounted the cameras with practiced, silent speed. I watched a technician install a new deadbolt on my front door, the wood shavings falling onto the welcome mat my mother had placed there. A knot of guilt, thick and choking, rose in my throat. This was my family. My mother, who had packed my lunches. My father, who had taught me to ride a bike. My brother, who I had a long time ago considered my friend. I was locking them out. I was preparing to call the police on my own blood. The fear was a cold, sharp blade under my ribs, fear of the inevitable explosive confrontation. The outrage was a fire that kept me from shaking. But beneath both was a profound, terrible clarity. This wasn't about a house. This was about my life. They had shown their intentions. They believed that my success, my property, my very autonomy was a family commodity to be divided as they saw fit. They had disrespected my personal boundaries my entire life, and this was the final unforgivable escalation. I was reinforcing the value of personal freedom, and I was starting with my own. At 11:23 a.m., Evans's voice came through my phone. "System is live. All new locks are secured. The only way in is with the master code, which only you have. We are clear." "Thank you, Evans," I said. "Send me the invoice." I closed my laptop. The drive back to Maplewood Drive was the longest of my life. I didn't park across the street this time. I parked in my own driveway. I walked up my own front path. I entered the master code, my company's founding date, into the new gleaming silver keypad. The lock chirped and clicked open. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of their things: my mother's floral perfume, my dad's cigars, the stale fast food from Miles's van. Their ugly floral couch was squatting in my living room. Their boxes were piled in my foyer. I ignored it all. I walked to my new living room window, the one overlooking the street, and I waited. I didn't have to wait long. At 4:52 p.m., Miles's beat-up landscaping van rumbled down the street, packed to the gills with more of their possessions. My parents' sedan pulled in right behind it. They were laughing, my mother holding a bag of takeout. They looked casual, triumphant, like conquering heroes returning with the spoils. My father clapped Miles on the back. They were expecting an easy move-in. They were expecting me to be waiting inside defeated. Miles, whistling, grabbed a box of his old video games and sauntered up the front walk. He didn't even knock. He reached for the doorknob and twisted it. It didn't turn. He jiggled it, his whistle cutting off. He frowned. He pulled the spare key, my spare key, from his pocket and tried to jam it into the lock. It wouldn't even go in. The new deadbolt was in a different place. His frown deepened. He truly looked at the door for the first time. He saw the new shiny keypad. He stared at it, his head tilted like a dog seeing a magic trick. He jabbed a few random numbers. The keypad flashed red, access denied. And then his eyes lifted. He saw it. The new, dark, unblinking dome of the camera I'd had installed right above the door, staring directly at him. His face, a mask of casual entitlement, melted. It went from confusion to disbelief, and then as he realized what he was looking at, it curdled into a pale, dawning rage. Miles hammered on the door with his fist. "Lyra, I know you're in there. Open this damn door." "What did you do?" "My father." Harold lumbered up the walkway, his face darkening as he saw the new keypad. My mother Diane hovered behind him, her arms crossed, the bag of takeout dangling from her wrist. "What is this?" My father boomed, his voice accustomed to instant obedience. "Lyra, stop this foolishness and let your family in." I stood at the window, my phone in my hand, the security app open. I pressed the talk icon for the front door camera. My voice, amplified by the speaker, cut through the evening air, clear, calm, and unnervingly loud. "This is not your home. You are trespassing on private property." The three of them froze. They looked around, confused, before realizing the voice was coming from the camera above their heads. My mother stepped forward, her face a mask of wounded performance. "Lyra, baby, what are you doing? It's us. We just went to get the rest of our things. Stop this game and open the door, it's cold." Her voice laced with that familiar saccharine guilt. It was the same voice she'd used when I was 15, after she'd read my entire private journal, and I'd locked myself in my room. "Don't be dramatic, Lyra. Families don't have secrets. Now open the door." "This is not a game, Mother," I said, my voice echoing. "You entered my home without my permission. You have no legal right to be here. I am giving you one chance to take your belongings from the porch and leave." "How dare you!" My father surged forward, jabbing a thick finger at the camera. "I am your father. We are a family. You don't talk to us about legal rights. You open this door right now or I'll break it down." The memory hit me like a physical blow. My father standing over me when my first credit card bill arrived, enraged that I'd bought my own laptop for college instead of using the ancient family desktop. "I control the finances in this house. You will return it, and I will decide what you need. If you attempt to damage my property, Harold, I will add it to the police report." The use of his first name hung in the air, a shocking, cold offense. Miles, who had been circling the porch, suddenly lunged, grabbing the decorative iron chair I'd planned for the patio. "You're crazy!" he screamed, hoisting it. "You locked us out. You're calling the cops on your own family." "Put the chair down, Miles," I commanded, my voice flat, betraying none of the adrenaline singing in my veins. "This isn't your house. It was never your compound. It's mine. You were never invited to live here." "We're family, you selfish bitch," he roared, his face purple. "You have all this. You're supposed to share." Mom and Dad's rental fell through, they had nowhere to go. The classic dismissal. My hard-won success, my all this, was never mine. It was a communal resource they felt entitled to. The lie about the rental was the final straw. I knew for a fact their lease wasn't up for 3 months. This was pure, calculated opportunism. And then the external pressure I'd been waiting for. A massive moving truck, the kind used for long-haul moves, turned the corner onto Maplewood Drive. It slowed its air brakes hissing and pulled up to the curb right behind their sedan. Two men in uniforms hopped out, clipboards in hand. My father's face went white. He had clearly hired them to move the rest of their furniture from the storage unit, timing it for after I was supposed to have arrived, and capitulated. One of the movers walked up the lawn. "Perry residence, we've got the rest of your items from storage unit 23B. My family just stared at him, trapped between the locked door and the public spectacle of their life's belongings sitting on the street. The neighbors were watching now. Curtains were twitching. Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down was blatantly standing on her porch. This was the peak of their humiliation, the moment their entitlement slammed into the unyielding wall of reality. My mother finally broke. The performance was over. "Lyra, please," she wailed, genuine tears of panic and rage streaming down her face. "Don't do this to us. People are watching. What will they think? We'll be ruined." "You should have thought of that," I said, my voice hardening. "You should have thought of that before you decided to steal my home. You have 5 minutes to remove yourselves from my property." "Or what?" My father spat, his aggression returning. "You'll call the cops. They'll laugh at you. You can't arrest your own parents." "You are trespassers," I said, letting the words sink in. "The local police have already been dispatched, Harold. They were notified of a non-violent trespass in progress 10 minutes ago. I suggest you and your things are off my lawn when they arrive." The panic was no longer subtle. It was stark, ugly terror. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Miles dropped the chair with a clatter. My father looked up and down the street, his face ashen. He finally understood. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't a phase. This was a calculation. I had outmaneuvered them at every turn, using the very logic and rules of the world they claimed to respect. The sound was faint at first, a distant rising wail against the suburban quiet. But it was unmistakable. It was growing closer. Red and blue lights flashed at the end of the street, painting the trees in strobing colors. Police sirens. They were here. The arrival of the 2 police cruisers turned the confrontation into a public spectacle. The officers were calm, professional, and listened to my father's blustering theatrical performance of the confused, concerned parent. Then they listened to my voice, clear and amplified from the security speaker. "Officers, my name is Lyra Perry. I am the sole owner of this property. I have the digital deed and closing documents on my phone. These individuals, my family, entered my home without my permission while I was abroad and attempted to take possession. They are trespassers. I want them removed." It was that simple. The legal reality cut through the emotional manipulation. The police didn't see family. They saw a property owner and trespassers. After a heated, whispered argument where my father's face went from red to a terrifying pale white, the officers gave them the final order: leave the property immediately. My mother let out a theatrical wail. "You're throwing your own mother out on the street!" But the officers were unmoved. "Ma'am, you need to get in your car." The logistical aftermath was immediate. Their cars were full. The moving truck they'd hired was technically for moving in, not moving out. The movers, refusing to be part of a domestic dispute, declared their contract fulfilled and left. My family was forced to leave with only what they could fit in their 2 vehicles, leaving a chaotic pile of boxes, a few lamps, and that hideous floral couch on my front lawn. My father's recliner and their dining set were still inside my house. They drove off, Miles peeling out his tires, screaming in the quiet street. The neighbors' curtains finally closed. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. I watched them go, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I waited until their taillights vanished. Then I called Michael. "They're gone," I said, my voice hollow. "But they left. A lot of their belongings. Some on the lawn, some still inside." "Good," he said, all business. "Don't touch a thing. Don't move the couch. It's crucial we follow the letter of the law regarding abandoned property. They want to play this game, we'll play it better." Within an hour, he had drafted a formal notice. It stated that Harold, Diane, and Miles Perry had abandoned their personal property at my address. It gave them a legal window 30 days to arrange for a supervised third-party removal at their own expense, and during a 2-hour window when my security team would be present. If they failed to comply, their property would be deemed forfeit, professionally removed, and the costs of disposal and storage would be billed to them directly. It was brutal, sterile, and necessary. I sent it via certified mail the next morning. Only then, after the police were gone and the legal letters were sent, did the adrenaline finally drain away. I walked through my house. The smell of my mother's perfume and my father's coffee was an invasion. I saw their boxes in my foyer, my father's recliner smugly occupying my study. I sank onto the bottom step of my own staircase, surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal, and the full weight of it finally broke me. The shock was a physical cold. The sorrow was a suffocating pressure. This wasn't just an intrusion, it was a character assassination. They had looked at my success, my independence, my entire life's work, and seen it not as something to celebrate, but as an asset to be seized. They hadn't been proud of me. They had been envious. They hadn't seen a daughter or a sister. They'd seen a resource they were entitled to. The betrayal was so absolute, so fundamental, it felt like it had rewritten my entire childhood. Every past slight, every dismissal, every time they'd called me selfish for wanting my own space, it all clicked into place. This was who they always were. I had just finally bought a house big enough to make their intentions clear. I cried. Not for them, but for the family I wished I had, the family I had been pretending I had for 29 years. But as I sat there, the sorrow began to curdle, hardening into a new sharp sense of empowerment. The guilt was gone. The fear was gone. All that remained was a cold, hard clarity. I could not compromise my values. I could not negotiate on my own safety or my right to my own life. They had forced this, and I had met them not with the emotional hysterics they expected, but with logic, law, and strategy. I had won. I stood up, went to the kitchen, and started scrubbing the counters, wiping away the smell of their coffee. I was reclaiming my agency, my home 1 square foot at a time. Weeks passed. The 30-day notice expired. They never replied. I paid a removal crew to haul their abandoned furniture to a disposal site. I sent them the bill, which I knew they'd ignore. I had new high-end furniture delivered. The house finally felt like mine. I was working from my study, the sun hitting my new desk, when the next certified letter arrived. This one wasn't from my lawyer. It was from the county courthouse. My hands were steady as I opened it. They were suing me. My parents and my brother had filed a frivolous, malicious lawsuit, not for the property, but for emotional distress, unlawful eviction, and elder neglect, claiming I had lured them to the home with promises of a family compound and then thrown them out on a whim. They were trying to manipulate social norms, painting me as a cold, heartless daughter, and themselves as the innocent victims. The physical battle was over, but they had just declared a new war, a war of public perception. The courtroom was beige and windowless, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. It was a sterile, neutral box, the complete opposite of the emotional chaos my family had tried to create. They sat at the opposing table, Harold, Diane, and Miles, flanked by a slick lawyer who looked like he'd stepped out of a daytime television ad. They were dressed in their somber best, my mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, my father looking stoic and wronged, Miles slouching with a look of sullen resentment. They were performing the role of the victims, a narrative they had polished for weeks. I sat beside Michael, my back straight. I wore a simple dark blue suit. I felt no fear, no guilt. That had all been burned away in the weeks of preparation. All that remained was a cold, hard resolve. This was just another negotiation. Only the terms were my freedom and my name. My family's lawyer opened, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. He painted a picture of a doting, close-knit American family, torn apart by the cold, inexplicable actions of a successful but isolated daughter. He spoke of implied promises and elderly parents left emotionally and financially destitute. He was good. He was weaving a story designed to prey on social norms to make the judge see a heartless child, not a property owner. I kept my hands folded on the table in front of me. I looked at the judge, and only the judge. My internal monologue was quiet focused. Resilience isn't just about surviving the attack. It's about enduring the fallout. It's about standing in the light and speaking the truth, even when your attackers are your own blood. This isn't a family dispute. It's a legal defense. And I have the facts. Then it was Michael's turn. He was the opposite of their lawyer. He was calm, methodical, and utterly devoid of performance. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not a case about feelings. It is a case about facts, and the facts are indisputable." He didn't just walk the judge through the timeline, he displayed it on the courtroom monitors. Exhibit A. The certified deed to the house on Maplewood Drive. My name, Lyra Perry, and my name alone. Exhibit B. The closing document signed and dated 2 days before my flight to Germany. Exhibit C. The family group chat logs. My clear statement, "I'll be focusing on settling in this weekend." Their ambiguous entitled replies. There was not a single message from me promising them a place to live, not one word of invitation. Exhibit D. The flight records. Undeniable proof I was not even in the country when, as he put it, the plaintiffs took illegal possession of my client's home. And then the centerpiece of our defense. Exhibit E, the high-definition time-stamped video from my new security system. The courtroom was silent as the monitor showed the confrontation at the doorstep. They saw Miles try to jam the key in. They saw him hoist my chair, his face purple with rage, screaming, "You selfish bitch!" They saw my father lunge at the door, threatening to break it down. They heard my mother's wailing, not about love, but about what the neighbors would think. And they heard my voice over and over, clear and steady, "You are trespassing. Leave the property. I am calling the police." My mother, seeing her own panicked, manipulative performance played back in the stark clarity of the courtroom, let out a small, choked sob. It was no longer a performance. It was shame. Michael wasn't finished. "We call Mrs. Eleanor Henderson to the stand." My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, was sworn in. She was nervous but firm. "Yes, I saw them," she said, pointing at my family. "I saw them moving in that morning. I thought it was strange because Lyra had told me she wasn't back from her trip until that evening." Their lawyer tried to rattle her on cross-examination. "Isn't it true you're friends with Miss Perry?" Mrs. Henderson looked at him over her glasses. "I've spoken to the young woman twice. I'm not her friend. I'm just a person who believes in property lines and calling things what they are. And that, sir, was a break-in." The community perspective, the simple American value of justice and fairness, was now on the record. I remained composed, a stark contrast to my family's increasingly frantic whispers. Their lawyer tried one last tactic, trying to paint me as calculating and inhumanly cold. I met his gaze. My internal monologue was sharp. Calculating, yes. I calculated the cost of my freedom. I calculated the price of my safety, and I paid it. Morally grounded isn't about being weak. It's about being right. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Eris, had seen enough. She called a brief recess, but it was clear she had already made up her mind. When she returned, she didn't mince words. She looked directly at my parents and brother. "In my 12 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such a blatant and malicious abuse of the legal system." She systematically tore their case apart. "There was no lease, verbal or written. Therefore, there can be no unlawful eviction. There was no elder neglect. There was a clear, documented case of trespass." She turned to their lawyer. "The claim of emotional distress is particularly egregious, as the evidence shows all distress was caused by the plaintiff's own illegal actions and by their daughter's justifiable and frankly restrained response." She looked back at my family, her eyes hard. "This lawsuit is a transparent, frivolous attempt to extort a successful family member. It is an act of profound entitlement and emotional blackmail." Case dismissed with prejudice. My mother let out a strangled gasp. But the judge wasn't done. "Furthermore, This court finds that this lawsuit was filed maliciously and in bad faith. Therefore, I am ordering the plaintiffs Harold Perry, Diane Perry, and Miles Perry to pay the entirety of the defendant's legal fees and all associated court costs. It was a total devastating victory. The gavel cracked a sound as final as a door locking. My family sat stunned, their faces ashen. They had come to court seeking a financial windfall and public vindication. They left humiliated, exposed, and in debt to the very person they had tried to destroy. The gavel's echo seemed to follow me home. The victory in court wasn't a celebration, it was a cessation. The end of a war I never wanted to fight. I walked into my house, and for the first time the air felt truly, completely my own. There was no lingering scent of my mother's perfume, no ghostly imprint of my father's recliner. There was just the quiet hum of my servers and the smell of new paint. The bill for my legal fees, which Michael's office promptly forwarded to my family's last known address, was substantial. It was, I knew, a debt they could not easily pay. The financial consequences were immediate and brutal. News of the public court record and Mrs. Henderson's testimony had spread through our small town like wildfire. The Perry family name, which my parents had always held up as a standard of community values, was now toxic. Miles's landscaping business, which had always relied on local word of mouth, dried up. People stopped calling. Who wants a man with a documented history of trespass and malicious lawsuits trimming their hedges? His van was repossessed a month later. My parents' social life evaporated. The friends they'd had, the community groups my mother had been part of, all fell silent. They were socially isolated, their credibility shattered. Their attempt to weaponize social norms had backfired catastrophically, leaving them judged and found wanting by the very community they'd tried to manipulate. Their lives began to unravel, a direct consequence of their own greed and entitlement. I felt nothing. Not pity, not schadenfreude, just a cold, empty finality. They had made their choices. I was simply living with mine. My own processing was a quieter, more complex affair. In the weeks that followed, I went through the motions of reclaiming my space. I hired painters. I bought a beautiful minimalist walnut desk for my study. I planted a garden in the backyard. Each act was a conscious statement. This is mine. I choose this. I belong here. But in the quiet evenings, the grief would surface. It was a strange, hollow ache. I wasn't grieving the loss of my family as they were. I was grieving the loss of the idea of family I had clung to for 29 years. The resentment was there too, a sharp, bitter anger that they had forced me to this point, that they had made me choose between my own survival and them. But stronger than the grief, stronger than the resentment, was the relief. It was a slow, dawning realization that I was for the first time in my entire life truly free. I was no longer living under the shadow of their expectations. I was no longer the designated provider, the built-in safety net, the one who was supposed to sacrifice her happiness for their comfort. The guilt they had so expertly cultivated in me since childhood was gone, burned away by the harsh, clarifying fire of the betrayal. My sense of identity, which had always been tangled up in their needs, began to solidify. I was not just a daughter or a sister. I was Lyra Perry. I was a software entrepreneur who had just landed a major international deal. I was a homeowner who had successfully and legally defended her property. I was a resilient, self-reliant woman who had faced the worst-case scenario and had not only survived but triumphed. There was a deep ethical satisfaction in what I had done. This was never about revenge. It was about boundaries. It was about the fundamental right to one's own life and property, a right that is the very bedrock of personal freedom. I had proven that those rights are not negotiable, not even for blood. I had stood up for myself with logic, with the law, and with a moral clarity they could not understand. My life, once defined by their chaos, became peaceful. I worked. I hosted small dinners for my colleagues. I went for long runs through the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson and I now waved to each other daily, a silent mutual respect between us. My home was no longer a fortress, it was a sanctuary. Then 3 months after the court date, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Lyra, it's your mother. I know we've had our differences, but I just wanted to see how you are. Your father isn't doing well. We miss you. My hand, which had been steady signing contracts and dialing lawyers, trembled slightly. The old familiar tendril of guilt trying to find a crack to seep into. This wasn't an apology. It was an excuse. A test. A new, softer attempt to breach the walls I had spent so much to build. They were trying to re-enter my life not with force, but with the insidious, manipulative language of family obligation. I stared at the message, the 3 dots of the typing in progress bubble appearing and disappearing as my mother composed and deleted her next words. I was being forced to decide all over again just how far my boundaries extended and if they were strong enough to withstand the one weapon they had left. I stared at the glowing screen at my mother's words. Your father isn't doing well. We miss you. The text was a hook baited with the familiar potent poison of familial guilt. The 3 dots appeared and disappeared. She was waiting, expecting that old trained response, expecting me to crack. It was the last ghost, the final desperate attempt to find a foothold in my life. I saw it for exactly what it was, not an apology, but a probe. A test to see if the boundary I had built with steel and law had any weaknesses. I held my thumb over the screen. I didn't type a reply. I didn't ask what was wrong. I didn't engage in the game. Instead, I pressed block number. A confirmation popped up. Are you sure I was? Then I deleted the entire conversation thread. The screen went blank. And with that single, simple act, the war was finally truly over. I had won. The months that followed were a revelation. I returned fully to my home not as a defender, but as an inhabitant. I established routines that were entirely my own. I woke with the sun, made coffee in my quiet kitchen, and drank it on the front porch, watching the neighborhood wake up. I no longer checked the security app obsessively. I no longer flinched when a van that looked like Miles's drove down the street. The house ceased to be a fortress, and slowly, beautifully became a home. I planted a container garden on the back patio. I hosted a small dinner for my development team colleagues who respected my mind and my leadership. I went for long jogs, my feet pounding the pavement of my town. My community connections, once a source of anxiety, became a quiet strength, Mrs. Henderson and I progressed from waves to conversations over the fence about her hydrangeas and my new software launch. She never once mentioned the lawsuit or the confrontation. She just treated me with the simple, profound respect of a neighbor. That I realized was the admiration my family had craved, and I had earned the quiet acknowledgement of resilience, the acceptance of my right to be there. My professional life, the very thing that had triggered their envy, flourished. The success of the German deal had propelled my company to a new level. My work was sharp-focused and creative, fueled by the new, clean energy I had. My success wasn't just a symbol of my hard work anymore. It was the tangible proof of my agency. My small victories were quiet, but monumental. The first time I hosted a client meeting in my living room. The first night I fell asleep without locking my bedroom door. The first time I heard a knock and felt curiosity, not panic. I had learned more in the past 6 months than in the previous 29 years. I learned that autonomy isn't a gift, it's a right that must be fiercely protected. I learned that emotional clarity is more powerful than emotional manipulation. And I learned the hardest lesson of all, that courage isn't just about fighting strangers, it's about having the strength to enforce boundaries with the people you were supposed to be able to trust. The guilt was gone, replaced by a deep, unwavering understanding that I had done the only thing I could do. I had chosen my own life. Tonight, 6 months after the court date, I stood in the center of my living room. A soft rain tapped against the windows, but inside it was warm and still. I looked around at the space I had fought for, the art I had chosen, the books lining my shelves. This house was more than 4 walls and a roof. It was a testament. It was the physical manifestation of my self-determination. I looked at the front door, sleek and solid, the gleaming silver keypad dark for the night. It was no longer a symbol of violation or a point of defense. It was simply a door. My door. The catharsis was not a sudden explosion of joy, but a deep, quiet, cellular hum of peace. It was the triumph of resilience, the simple, profound satisfaction of standing in a place that was unequivocally mine. I had faced the ultimate betrayal and had not been broken. I had met manipulation with logic, entitlement with the law, and emotional warfare with unbending resolve. I had reaffirmed my own values. This was my home. This was my freedom. And in fighting for it, I had finally fully reclaimed myself. By reclaiming her home, Lyra reclaimed her life, closing a painful chapter for good. What did you think of the boundaries Lyra set? We read every single comment to hear your thoughts. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.